February 1945, Lingayen Gulf, Luzon, Philippines. The oppressive, suffocating humidity clung to everything, a wet, heavy blanket over the scarred and pockmarked landscape of the recently secured beachhead, where the acrid scent of cordite, damp earth, and the faint, sickly sweet odor of decay still hung faintly in the air, a pervasive miasma that coated the back of the throat. Sergeant Miles P. Henderson of the 716th Tank Battalion, his uniform stained with a patina of grease, sweat, and dark drying mud that felt like a second skin, stood isolated in a vast sea of churned, viscous earth and the discarded. Broken equipment of a retreating army, shattered crates, empty ammunition boxes, and a single, forlorn leather boot protruding from the muck. His entire world had narrowed to the singular. Mechanical prize his unit had just secured after a brief, sharp firefight with a stubborn rearguard, a skirmish that had ended with the sharp, final crack of M1 Garrons and the soft, wet thud of falling bodies in the jungle's edge. Before him, resting at a drunken, forlorn angle in the sucking, clawing muck of a rain-filled rice paddy, was a Japanese Type 95 Heigo light tank, serial number 1357 stenciled in fading white paint on its turret side. It was a creature from another world, a relic of a war that had already, decisively, technologically passed it by, a metallic dinosaur stranded on the wrong side of an evolutionary chasm. Yet for Henderson, a man who spoke the language of pistons and gears, it held an almost magnetic, scholarly fascination. It had been abandoned in a desperate hurry by its crew during the chaotic Japanese retreat from the overwhelming American landings, its right track shattered and mangled by a well-placed bazooka round, a few fresh, gleaming scars from .30 caliber machine gun fire stippling its hull like pockmarks. But otherwise, it was remarkably, almost miraculously intact. A small, blackened hole near the driver's viewport was the only evidence of the crew's final, futile resistance. For Henderson, a veteran mechanic from the Detroit industrial heartland before the war, a man who understood machines in his bones, for whom the synchronized hum of an assembly line was a symphony of progress. This was more than a mere captured enemy vehicle. It was a complex three-dimensional puzzle, a Rosetta Stone of Japanese industrial capability, tactical philosophy, and strategic limitation. He knelt, instinctively, ignoring the thick, cold mud, soaking instantly through his wool trousers with a chill that was startling, and ran a calloused, practiced hand along the cold, gritty, riveted steel of the vehicle's flank. The sensation was not of the smooth, welded, homogeneous armor of his own Sherman, but of a crude patchwork quilt of metal plates, clumsily and hastily fastened together, a stark contrast to the industrial elegance he was accustomed to. This can't be their frontline armor, he thought, a familiar, cold disbelief washing over him like a wave, a feeling that was equal parts professional incredulity and a deep, unsettling pity for the men who had to fight inside it. No modern army, facing the sheer industrial might we can bring to bear, would consciously build tanks this way. It defies every single principle of survivability and crew protection I have ever been taught. This was not just a vehicle. It was a statement, a confession of material poverty, and a radically different calculus of the value of a human life, and one he was only beginning to decipher. The Heigo was a stark study in minimalist, almost brutalist, design philosophy, a machine where every ounce of non-essential material seemed to have been stripped away in a ruthless pursuit of weight savings. It was small, barely cresting 7 tons, and sat so low to the ground it seemed to crouch, a predatory insect waiting to strike from ambush, its silhouette barely rising above the tall, trampled kunai grass. Its turret, offset awkwardly and jarringly to the left of the chassis, seemed disproportionately large for the tiny, cramped hull, giving the entire vehicle a top-heavy, almost comical silhouette, like a child's earnest drawing of a tank. The main gun, a 37mm weapon, peered myopically from the turret face, its barrel looking anemic and feeble compared to the long, powerful 75mm cannons on the Shermans Henderson commanded and maintained, which projected an aura of undeniable authority. But what truly captivated his professional attention, what sent a cold, slow ripple of tactical understanding down his spine, was the complete and utter absence of the one thing every American tank designer and crew member considered sacrosanct: meaningful, effective armor. A quick diagnostic tap with the steel head of his heavy wrench confirmed his grim, burgeoning suspicion. The sound was a tinny, hollow, and cheap clang, not the dense, resonant, solid thud of rolled, homogeneous armor plate he was accustomed to. The steel plating was shockingly, almost negligently thin, later calipered by intelligence teams to be no more than 12 millimeters at its thickest point on the vertical front glacis, and a mere 9 millimeters on the sides and rear, thinner than the armor on some American scout cars. This was barely enough to stop a heavy machine gun round like the 50 caliber BMG at anything but extreme long range, and it would offer the same resistance as tissue paper to the 75mm high explosive or armor-piercing rounds fired from an M4 Sherman at any conceivable combat range. This was not a vehicle designed for survival in a direct slugging match. It was a machine built for a single, fleeting moment in warfare. Strategic mobility and infantry support in the total absence of significant anti-tank threats. And for absolutely nothing else. A concept that was both alien and horrifying to the American mindset, which was built on a foundation of overwhelming firepower and individual survivability. Sergeant Henderson had personally seen the wreckage of dozens of Japanese tanks across the brutal, unforgiving island-hopping campaign, from the blood-soaked, shattered coral of Tarawa to the haunted, shadowy jungles of Saipan. But those were always charred, blackened, and grotesque husks, their thin hulls torn open like tin cans by high-explosive shells, their interiors transformed into ghastly, silent tombs filled with the charred remains of their crews, the air thick with the smell of cooked flesh and burned oil. They were artifacts of death, not objects of study. This particular Heigo was profoundly different. This was a pristine, largely operational vehicle that could be studied alive, its systems meticulously dismantled, its components laid bare on a canvas tarp, its entire design logic reverse-engineered and understood in a way a wreck never could. The mathematics of this discovery, the cold, hard, unassailable numbers of its armor thickness, its engine horsepower, its weight-to-power ratio, would be compiled into detailed, classified intelligence reports that would reshape American tactical doctrine for infantry tank engagements for the remainder of the war and inform future designs. Every assumption American GIs and tankers held about the inherent vulnerability of Japanese armor, about the terrifying, stark trade-offs Japanese engineers had been forced to make, about the sheer, unbridgeable disparity in industrial philosophy and resource allocation between the two warring nations, was about to be systematically confirmed, quantified, and meticulously archived by the physical evidence contained within this single, captured example of Japan's most numerous and widely used tank of the entire conflict. This one machine, serial number 1357, held within its riveted, fragile frame the entire tragic story of Japanese armored warfare, its early, deceptive triumphs, its fundamental crippling flaws, and its inevitable, catastrophic failure against a foe with a radically different approach to war-making, a foe for whom production lines were a weapon as potent as any fleet. The long, brutal journey to this moment of revelation on a muddy Filipino field had begun nearly 4 years earlier, on December 22, 1941, during the very same Japanese invasion of the Philippines. Then, the Type 95 Heigo had been a terrifying, new, and largely unknown weapon to the poorly equipped, desperate American and Filipino forces. Its 37mm gun could punch through the thin armor of the obsolete American M3 Stuarts, present in the islands with relative ease, while its own thin skin was largely immune to the 30 caliber machine guns and standard rifle fire that comprised the bulk of the defenders' pathetic anti-tank capability. At the Battle of Lingayen Gulf, Hago tanks of the elite 4th Tank Regiment had spearheaded the landings, their diesel engines roaring as they clattered noisily down landing craft ramps into the surf, their silhouettes stark against the rising sun. They provided crucial, mobile, and intimidating fire support that could keep pace with the advancing infantry, overwhelming static defensive positions and forcing the eventual, desperate retreat of American and Filipino forces into the Bataan Peninsula. To the infantryman on the ground, clutching his Springfield rifle and a handful of grenades, the Japanese tank was a steel monster, an invulnerable behemoth that symbolized an unstoppable military machine which had swept across Southeast Asia with shocking, humiliating speed. It had proven devastatingly effective in the early campaigns in China and the sweeping maneuvers through Malaya, where it faced little in the way of modern integrated anti-tank warfare. Its lightweight, compact design allowed it to traverse narrow jungle trails, swampy ground, and primitive, flimsy bridges that would have bogged down or broken under heavier European-style tanks. Its reliable, air-cooled diesel engine provided it with a good operational range, crucial for campaigning across the vast, undeveloped territories of Asia. In those first, chaotic and victorious months of the war, the Hago's specific advantages, its strategic mobility, its mechanical simplicity, and its adequacy against unprepared infantry were pronounced and contributed significantly to the powerful, pervasive myth of Japanese invincibility, a myth that was as potent a weapon as the tank itself. But by mid-1942, as American forces shook off the paralyzing shock of Pearl Harbor and began their arduous, bloody, and determined offensive across the vast expanse of the Pacific, the Hago's fatal, inherent flaws became starkly and brutally apparent. The environment of the Pacific theater was a cruel, unforgiving crucible that tested every design assumption to the breaking point and beyond. On Guadalcanal, in the tangled, suffocating, green hell of the jungles where visibility was measured in mere feet, Marine anti-tank teams learned through brutal, hands-on experience that the Hago was not a monster, but a vulnerable, fragile target. Its thin armor, which had seemed impervious to rifle fire in the early days, was hopelessly vulnerable to the new, revolutionary M1 bazooka, whose shape-charged warhead could slice through its plates as if they were warm butter, unleashing a jet of superheated plasma into the cramped crew compartment. It was equally vulnerable to the 37mm M3 anti-tank gun, a standard infantry support weapon, and even to well-placed, direct shots from the 75mm pack howitzers used by the Marines in daring direct-fire roles. The tank quickly earned a series of grim and derisive nicknames from American soldiers who rapidly lost their fear of it. Cigarette lighter for its terrifying, predictable tendency to burst into violent flames when its fuel or ammunition was hit. Or Ronson for its reliable ignition, named after the famous lighter slogan. The Battle of the Tenarú River on Guadalcanal provided a textbook, horrific example of its inadequacy. There, a handful of Hagos from the Ichiki detachment, attempting a reckless, futile night attack across the sandbar, were wiped out in a matter of minutes by a combination of concentrated 37mm anti-tank fire, 50 caliber machine guns, and direct hits from field artillery. Their thin armor offered no protection whatsoever. The tanks were transformed almost instantly into blazing funeral pyres, their crews incinerated within the red-hot steel shells, their screams swallowed by the roar of the flames and the crackle of small arms fire. This grim pattern of catastrophic loss repeated itself with monotonous, tragic regularity across every subsequent island battle, a relentless demonstration of technological and doctrinal inferiority. At Tarawa, Japanese Hagos were dug into static revetments and used as immobile pillboxes, a tacit, desperate admission of their utter inability to maneuver effectively against American armor in open combat, transforming them from vehicles into fixed, vulnerable fortifications. They were destroyed one by Sherman tanks firing high-explosive rounds that, while often ineffective against the thick, sloped frontal armor of German tanks, simply blew the light Japanese vehicles apart, shearing off tracks, jamming turrets, or igniting internal ammunition with a single concussive blast. On Saipan, in the more open terrain of the island's central plain, they were hopelessly and tragically outclassed by the M4 Sherman in direct stand-up combat. The Sherman's powerful 75mm gun could destroy a Hago at any conceivable combat range, from over a mile away, the shell arriving before the sound of the gun. In contrast, the Hago's low-velocity, weak 37mm gun could only hope to penetrate the Sherman's thicker side or rear armor at point-blank range, a near-suicidal proposition that few crews survived to attempt. The engagements were less battles than systematic one-sided executions, a brutal clinical demonstration of qualitative and quantitative inferiority. American tank crews developed a cold, professional, almost dismissive confidence when facing Japanese armor, a feeling born of the fundamental understanding that they operated within a protected, powerful steel box, while their enemy, tragically, did not. This confidence was a weapon in itself, fostering an aggressive tactical mindset that the Japanese could never counter. But the true, quantified, and meticulously documented extent of the Hago's profound vulnerability, the specific engineering decisions and grand strategic miscalculations that made such one-sided combat inevitable, would not be fully understood until technical intelligence units, the unsung analytical heroes of the material war, began capturing intact examples for detailed forensic examination. The Hago at Lingayen in February 1945 provided that golden, invaluable opportunity. A specialized technical intelligence team from the Army's Mobile Exploitation Unit, The same groups of brilliant engineer sleuths who hunted for V-2 rockets and Me-262 jet fighters in Europe descended upon the captured tank with the focus of archaeologists uncovering a lost civilization. For 3 full days, under the sweltering, oppressive Philippine sun, they treated the vehicle not as a weapon, but as a complex crime scene, meticulously documenting, measuring, photographing from every angle, and then systematically dismantling it with practiced precision, their hands moving with the delicate assurance of surgeons. Their final comprehensive report, later classified and distributed to Allied commands across the Pacific, laid bare the stark, revealing specifications that explained both the Hago's early, deceptive successes and its ultimate, predictable obsolescence in the face of American industrial power, a post-mortem of a failed design philosophy. The Type 95 Hago specifications revealed a vehicle optimized for a war that had ceased to exist after 1941, a relic of a different time and a different enemy. Its combat weight was a mere 7.4 tons, lighter than some American armored cars, a featherweight in a heavyweight fight. It housed a cramped, inadequate crew of only 3. A commander who also had to serve as the gunner and radio operator if one existed, a loader who also manned a whole machine gun, and a driver. This overworked, unsustainable arrangement placed an immense cognitive and physical load on the commander, critically crippling situational awareness and rate of fire in the heat of battle, ensuring he was always a step behind his better-supported American counterpart. The armor, as Sergeant Henderson had immediately discerned with a tap of his wrench, was catastrophically, almost criminally thin, a maximum of 12 mm on the vertical front hull and 12 mm on the turret face, with side and rear armor of only 9 mm. Main armament was the Type 94 37mm gun, a weapon with a low muzzle velocity and poor penetration characteristics by 1944 standards, effective only at very short ranges against soft targets or the very weakest of armor. Secondary armament consisted of 2 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns, one in the hull and one in the turret rear. Its power plant was a 120 horsepower Mitsubishi 6-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine, which provided a respectable top speed of 45 km/h on roads and an operational range of 250 km, one of its few genuinely positive attributes that was rendered irrelevant by its combat deficiencies. The armor design and construction methods were particularly revealing and shocking to the American engineers. The 12mm frontal plate was not sloped, a fundamental, well-understood principle of modern tank design that could effectively double the line-of-sight thickness of armor against incoming fire. Instead, it was bolted and riveted perfectly vertically, offering a flat, perfect target that presented its full, inadequate thickness to any incoming round. The 9mm side armor could be penetrated by standard .30 caliber armor-piercing ammunition, fired from a Browning M1919 machine gun at ranges under 500 yards. The crew compartment was unbearably cramped and offered no room for a fourth crewman to act as a dedicated loader, which drastically slowed the rate of fire compared to Allied tanks. Most critically and most horrifyingly for the crew, there was no armor-spalling protection on the interior whatsoever. When a shell struck the outside, even if it didn't fully penetrate, the tremendous kinetic energy would shatter the rivets holding the plates together, sending hot, sharp metal shards, rivet shot, ricocheting around the interior at supersonic, lethal speeds, effectively turning the entire fighting compartment into a deadly blender of flying metal. Furthermore, the tank notoriously lacked a radio as standard equipment, forcing commanders to direct their drivers through a primitive and utterly inadequate system of hand signals, a crippling limitation in the dust, noise, smoke, and utter chaos of battle that guaranteed a total breakdown in command and control at the most critical moment. The weight saved by this minimalist, almost primitive design philosophy translated directly into the Hago's strategic mobility, but the ultimate terrible cost in crew survivability was absolute and unforgiving. Combat reports from every front consistently showed that Hagos hit by anything larger than a heavy machine gun, be it a 37mm anti-tank gun, a bazooka rocket, or a 75mm tank shell, were almost always destroyed, with a catastrophic and total loss of crew. A single hit was almost invariably a final death sentence for the 3 men inside, a verdict delivered by their own country's industrial choices. The man ultimately behind this ruthless design philosophy was Tomi Ohara, a senior and influential engineer at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Facing an Imperial Army requirement for a light tank that was cheap to produce in large numbers, highly mobile for operations in China, and suitable for the vast, infrastructure-poor expanses of Asia, Hara and his team made the same brutal calculation as his naval aviation counterparts, designing the G4M Betty bomber. Protection would be sacrificed, almost entirely, for the holy trinity of strategic mobility, industrial output, and perceived tactical necessity. The armor was designed to be just thick enough to stop small arms fire and shell fragments, the primary threats expected in the China theater. The armament was deemed sufficient to engage infantry, machine gun nests, and light fortifications. The overarching goal was not to win a duel with enemy tanks, a contingency considered highly unlikely in the Asian theater, but to support the infantry and exploit breakthroughs in the enemy's lines. The mathematics driving the design were brutally simple and reflected Japan's profound strategic predicament. Japan's industrial base was a fraction of America's. They could not hope to match the colossal, awe-inspiring output of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and the other industrial hubs of the United States. Therefore, the doctrine was to produce large numbers of good enough tanks that were logistically simple and could be deployed across the vast, overextended perimeter of their new empire. The first prototypes were completed in 1934, and the tank entered full service in 1935, hence the Type 95 designation for the year 2595 in the Japanese imperial calendar. It was, for its time and its intended purpose against China, a competent, even clever design, a product of its specific strategic context. But by the time the Heigo was encountered again in the Philippines in 1945, it was a hopeless anachronism, a pathetic relic fighting a war for which it was never designed and could not possibly win. The Japanese army, recognizing its profound weaknesses in the face of overwhelming American material power, had already developed and fielded more capable models like the Type 97 Chiha medium tank, with thicker 25mm armor and a more powerful 57mm gun. But production of the obsolete Heigo continued in significant numbers until 1943, and it remained in widespread, desperate use until the very end of the war. Not because it was effective, but simply because it was what Japan had. It was a tool, however blunt and broken, that was available in quantity, a testament to the inertia of mass production and the dire shortage of replacements. The captured tank at Lingayen, serial number 1357, was not an anomaly or a poorly manufactured example. It was the standard. Its thin, riveted armor was not a field modification or a result of degraded wartime production standards. It was the deliberate, calculated choice of designers and strategists who, constrained by severe resource limitations and a fundamentally different military ethos, valued strategic quantity and tactical mobility over individual vehicle quality and crew protection. This philosophy made a certain cold, logical sense in 1937 against Chinese forces who possessed very limited anti-tank capabilities. It was, however, a catastrophic and bloody failure by 1944 and 1945 against the overwhelming industrial might, technological sophistication, and relentless firepower of the United States military. The detailed forensic examination of the Heigo provided the final, physical, irrefutable proof of a fundamental and ultimately decisive asymmetry in the war. The United States built its weapons systems, from tanks to bombers, with a deep-seated, if sometimes imperfect, concern for the survival of the crew inside, viewing trained men as a valuable, non-expendable asset. Japan, constrained by a severe lack of raw materials, a smaller industrial base, and a different military ethos that emphasized sacrifice and the overriding importance of the mission, built weapons that were, in their very essence, expendable. The men inside them were, by the brutal, unspoken logic of the design, expendable as well. The story of the Type 95 Heigo is not just the story of an obsolete tank. It is the story of an industrial, technological, and profound philosophical gap that no amount of bravery, fanaticism, or tactical ingenuity could ever hope to bridge. The vehicle that had been a victorious spearhead in the early invasions of 1941 was, by 1945, little more than a mobile steel coffin, a stark, silent testament to a war machine that had been comprehensively outdesigned, outproduced, and outfought on a colossal, historic, and ultimately fatal scale. The story of the Heigo did not end with its dissection in the Philippines. The intelligence gleaned from serial number 1357 and other captured specimens rippled through the Allied war machine. reinforcing tactical doctrines that were already proving devastatingly effective. The knowledge that a .50 caliber round could punch through the Hago's side armor at 600 yards, or that a bazooka team had an almost guaranteed kill from any angle, was transformed into confident, aggressive small unit tactics that further demoralized Japanese infantry who relied on the tanks for support. This hard-won data also flowed back to design bureaus in the United States, where it subtly influenced the post-war debate on tank design. While the American focus would remain on heavy armor and powerful main guns to counter the Soviet threat, the Hago served as a permanent, cautionary case study in the perils of extreme design compromise. It was a lesson in what happened when mobility was pursued to the utter negation of protection, a ghost from a different kind of war that whispered warnings to a new generation of engineers about the absolute necessity of balancing the three pillars of tank design: firepower, protection, and mobility. For the Japanese, the Hago's legacy was one of painful, forced evolution. Even as the Hago was being outclassed, its successor, the Type 97 Chiha, was being pushed into service. The Chiha was a direct response to the shortcomings of the Hago, featuring thicker 25mm armor and a more potent 57mm gun. Yet it too was a product of the same constrained industrial and strategic mindset. While an improvement, it remained critically vulnerable to the latest American tanks and anti-tank weapons, a half step in a race that required a giant leap. The Japanese army found itself in a desperate race it could not win, attempting to bridge a technological gap that widened with every passing month of the war, a gap measured in millions of tons of steel and the output of thousands of factories. The Hago thus symbolizes not just a single failure, but the beginning of a cascade of obsolescence. It was the foundational model of Japanese armored doctrine, a doctrine that was flawed at its core when pitted against a major industrial power. Its continued use in 1945 was a testament to Japanese tenacity and desperation, but also to the tragic inertia of a war machine that had run out of time, resources, and options. The rusting hulks of Hagos that littered the Pacific Islands became silent, metallic gravestones for an entire military philosophy, one that valued the spirit of the warrior, but failed to provide him with the tools for survival in a modern, material-intensive conflict. They were monuments to a courage that was undeniable, but also to a strategic blindness that proved fatal, a permanent reminder that will alone cannot triumph over the relentless, crushing logic of industrial and technological supremacy.